The four-star general stood up slowly, careful not to let her chair scrape the floor. Years of command had taught her how to move without being noticed, and tonight she wanted exactly that. No salutes, no whispered recognition. Just a quiet meal before driving back to the base. She had a long night ahead, filled with reports and strategy sessions. This diner was her brief moment of peace, a small island of normalcy in a life defined by duty. But as she turned to leave, she felt that familiar, prickling sense that came just before an ambush. Someone was watching her. Her training kicked in instinctively. She scanned the room, her eyes quickly assessing every patron, every shadow. And then she saw him. Or rather, she saw her. At a small table in the far corner of the diner, a little girl sat frozen in her seat, eyes wide and unblinking, locked onto the general's plate. The general frowned, confused. The girl wasn't looking at her uniform, which was mostly hidden beneath a civilian jacket. She wasn't looking at the discreetly pinned medals. She was staring at the plate. The general followed the child's intense gaze and saw what she saw. A simple slice of apple pie, untouched, with steam still curling gently upward from the warm filling. It was the diner's special, and she'd ordered it on a whim, more out of habit than hunger. Something in the girl's stare stopped the general mid-step. Her hand, which had been reaching for her purse, tightened on the strap. It wasn't just curiosity in the girl's eyes. It was a deep, profound longing that felt ancient and raw. Across from the girl sat her father, a man in his early 30s with tired eyes and a posture that suggested he carried more than just the weight of a long day. "I'm sorry," he said, his words barely audible. "She doesn't mean to stare. She hasn't eaten dessert in a long time." He looked down at his own hands, as if ashamed of the admission. The general hesitated. She had negotiated ceasefires with warlords and commanded thousands of soldiers in high-stakes operations. She looked back at the child, who shrank slightly under her gaze, but didn't look away from the pie. The girl's focus was absolute. It was more than just the taste of sugar. It was the taste of a small, forgotten joy. His wife had passed away 2 years earlier after a sudden illness, and since then, life had been a series of narrow escapes. Rent was paid just in time, groceries were stretched thin, and sleep was a luxury he often sacrificed so Lily could feel safe and secure. Sometimes, when he couldn't find a sitter he could afford, he had to bring Lily along, letting her sleep on a cot in a quiet corner of the building while he worked. Tonight, this dinner was a rare treat. They had split a bowl of soup, She stood again, this time with a new sense of purpose, and walked to the counter. She paid her bill, and then, without a second thought, she paid Mark and Lily's bill as well. She left a tip on the counter, an amount large enough to make the tired waitress blink twice and look up in surprise. As Eleanor turned to leave, Mark rushed after her, his voice shaking with a mix of gratitude and pride. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his hands fluttering nervously. I can't accept that." Eleanor raised a hand, stopping his protest. Her voice was firm but kind. "Yes, you can," she said, looking him straight in the eye. "Because someday, when you're able, you'll do the same for someone else. You'll pay it forward. It's how this works. It's an order." The last part was said with a hint of a smile, and Mark swallowed hard and nodded, understanding. The next morning, back in the world of official reports and strategic commands, Eleanor received a briefing she couldn't ignore. She leveraged the power and influence she had earned over a lifetime of service, not for a military objective, but for this. By the end of the week, the funding wasn't just restored. It was expanded. There was no press release, no ceremony. No one knew of the general's involvement. It was just action, quiet and effective. Weeks later, Eleanor found herself back at the same diner. This time, as she walked in, Lily saw her and ran up to her, her backpack bouncing on her shoulders, her eyes shining with excitement. "General Eleanor," she announced proudly. "We have dessert on Fridays now. It's our rule." Mark stood behind her, looking healthier, steadier. The exhaustion in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet confidence. He picked up extra work through a new base maintenance contract, one that Eleanor had quietly reviewed and approved.